What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 80 of the Book Binge here on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week, we are reviewing a book that I'm very, very excited to be covering this time around. That being the first book in the Edan trilogy by Philip Chase, The Way of Edan. And I'm pretty sure this is the first review that you're ever going to see with my new camera and actually with updated lighting as well. The first couple videos that I did with this, it wasn't quite so good, but I don't really have a whole lot to say in this introduction other than the obvious statement that I suppose I probably should be making. That being that I am not in any way beholden to Philip Chase. He is a fellow booktuber. I've had a number of interactions with him, but the amount of interactions that we've had can be counted on two hands, possibly even just one hand, and nearly all of those interactions have been in YouTube comment sections where one time I invited him onto the channel, but he was too busy to be able to join to talk about something like The Dark Tower, which, at some point in the future we may be able to do sometime after we discuss this book or the entire trilogy later this year or whatever happens. But the point is that at this point in time, Philip and I aren't friends yet. We don't know each other. I don't know him very well. I've only watched a couple handfuls of his videos, and like I said, we haven't really interacted very much. So anything that I say in this review was not paid for, it not sponsored by Philip or anything like that. It's not to butter him up so that I can have him on the channel, because I'm sure he's just fine with somebody who doesn't love his book, or even people who don't really enjoy his book. Like, Philip, of all people, I'm sure is very aware that people's opinions and tastes on different things can be different, and therefore I don't think basically any of the reviewers you're going to watch who are reviewing this book positively are doing so out of some sort of personal obligation or something to Philip or anything like that. I genuinely think they're being honest. If there are any that are being dishonest, I think that's definitely in the vast minority of the reviewers. As for me, again, I am honest about how I feel about this book. I'm honest about all of the books that I review. There have been books that I've reviewed in the past that have gone completely against the grain of what my viewers or friends or whatnot thought about those books, or what they say might have wanted me to say about those books. One of those being The Bird Book, or The Obscene Bird of Night by Jose Donoso. That was one that I, at this point, quite famously amongst my friend group, don't enjoy much at all. I enjoyed part one, but everything else I think is terrible, more or less. And I have many friends who really like that book. I'm not going to review a book positively just because my friends want me to, and I'm not going to review Philip's book positively just because he might want me to. I've not interacted with him in regards to this book prior to or even after my finishing of this book pretty much at all, other than my saying I was excited to read it. So at this point, I think I've had enough chit-chat and disclaimer, and I just want to talk about the actual book itself. I'm not reviewing this based off of Philip. I'm reviewing it based off of the merits of the book and what I enjoyed about it. Speaking of, let's start with the good of The Way of Edan. I think there is a lot to love about this book. First and foremost being that it is a very classic fantasy book, but perfectly also usurps the expectations that might come with that at the same time. Now, I'm not 100% sure if that makes total sense, but the way that I think of it is the writing and the tone of the story feels very classic fantasy. And I say this as somebody who hasn't read a lot of fantasy. Just mind you, I haven't read a whole ton of fantasy, and I don't have like a whole ton of examples that I can bring up. I just know that based off of what I've read from like Lord of the Rings and a couple more modern series and stuff like that, this feels more akin to fantasy of, the 20th century as opposed to fantasy of the last 10 or 15 years. Like, far more like classic fantasy. And the thing that I think really makes it stand out from classic fantasy, despite being very familiar in that sort of classic way, is that Philip plays on an absurd amount of tropes in really fun ways. If you think of a random fantasy trope from something that you've, read before, so say like farm boy leaves home because he's the chosen one or something like that, Philip uses, a sort of style of that trope, but then also includes a bunch of other sort of more subtle or less obvious tropes in other areas of the story, and uses them in ways that feels, like I said, familiar, but also changes it to flip a lot of them completely on their heads, or even the ones that he doesn't flip on their heads, uses them in a somewhat interesting way. So, say the protagonist of this book is still, somebody who reluctantly leaves home because of some circumstances, but the circumstances that force him out of his home aren't the same as what you might get from your normal classic fantasy. And even the scenario that caused what made him have to leave home, I'll say, because I'm not going to do any spoilers in this review, even those circumstances are somewhat predictable in that classic fantasy way, but again done in just a way that is new and interesting. I can't really explain more without actually getting into a somewhat more spoilery territory, but that's what I'll say about it. I just love the way that it does that. Another thing that I really appreciate and really enjoyed about The Way of Edan is its use of POVs. It's not just a single narrator, it's not just a single POV, and it's not even just like two narrators who are, going through two different storylines and then they meet up at the end. There is that element to it, but there's also at least a handful of other points of view and narrators, so to speak, in the story, even outside of, I would say, I guess the two primary main character POVs I would say there are, and then there's a handful of other side ones as well. And all of them are necessary for the story. Some of them were unexpected. I wasn't expecting to get POVs from a couple of those characters, but they all have their place in the story. And in fact, the ways that they weave together and kind of interact with each other, particularly in like the final third of the book, or at least the beginning of the final third of the book, there's a couple POVs that occur that had my brain spinning and just like, wait, I know how this interacts with this part of this one POV from earlier in the book and this one as well. So they kind of like all tie together in a specific way. In some ways that some of the POVs and scenes tie together, you might not even notice if you're not paying attention. They're not like really subtle or hidden or anything like that. They're just not like in your face explaining how they interact with each other. But if you're paying any form of attention to the story, they'll jump out at you and you'll be like, hey, I noticed that. And it's really fun to be able to experience that in the book. All of the POVs, all of the scenes, everything that is, kind of separate from each other in the first third or even the second third of the book, all weave together into a climax and a meetup that is really amazing. The final third, I thought, was quite enjoyable. I found the way that the stories all combine together and kind of come into this final climax, I suppose. Everything comes together in the climax in a way that I thought was unpredictable. I could not guess pretty much at any point exactly where the story was going next. I had ideas, and sometimes I was right, sometimes I was thinking along the right path, but there were other times where I was just completely wrong about where I thought the story was going to go or what was going to happen or what a specific reveal was going to be. I thought all of that worked very much in the book's favor. And even more along these lines as well, in terms of the different POVs and the combining together and whatnot. I love the way that every single POV, every single character, every single nation, pretty much every aspect of the story itself is never painted out in a supremely black or white way. I suppose the main character of the story, you can tell from the get-go, is kind of like, okay, this is your protagonist, this is your good guy, this is like, this is the one that you want to be following. But then every other POV, you kind of have questions. You're not entirely sure where they fall. The secondary POV, so the one that's kind of like the main character, if the main character didn't exist, or I guess just the second main character, I suppose, since they're two separate POVs and two separate parts of the world, and we'll talk about the world a little bit later. These two POVs you can kind of assume are good, but nearly every other POV, and even the way those characters and those nations and whatnot interact with each other is so interesting and realistic that I feel like they never felt like they were black and white. Even the characters and POVs who you're like, okay, well, this is a good guy, they don't necessarily do things, but they join with people or have certain, plot lines that are going on in the book that make you wonder for sure if you're actually right in that assumption. And that's how I felt all of the side character POVs, where you never actually know who's the good guy. And in fact, it makes it so that every character, instead of there being good guys and bad guys per se, every character is the good guy and the bad guy at the same time, depending on whose point of view you are in. If you're in the viewpoint of somebody from Addendum, you think that the Kergulese, or if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry. I'm probably going to pronounce any names or anything like that incorrectly, so that's my apologies. I'll have to have Philip fix me on that if I have a discussion with him about these books. But if you're, in the viewpoint of a character from Addendum, you're going to think the Kergulese are the bad guys. But if you are in, the POV of somebody from Kergullian, you're going to think that the Addonese are the bad guys. And the way Philip writes these characters, and again, these nations and everything, makes this work so splendidly and perfectly that it doesn't feel wrong. You can be in the POV of one or the other and be like, okay, yeah, this is a good guy, the other's a bad guy. But then he switches your POV so that you're in the different one, and you're also feeling, yeah, this is the good guy, they're the bad guy. It's just so wholly natural and human the way that all of this is written that I really appreciated. Finally, since I did mention the world just a little bit ago, saying that we would talk about it, I think that the history and the depth of the world and the lore associated with it is really, really good. I'm not going to say that The Way of Edan is on the level of Lord of the Rings, because I feel like that's kind of well, it's not that it's unfair. It's that Lord of the Rings is just on such a whole nother level. Middle Earth is just on another level. Any author doing what Tolkien did in terms of the lore and the history is just inhuman. Like, pretty much nobody could ever touch anything that Tolkien was able to do with his world. But I've never been so invested in the world or the depth of it or the lore and the history of it as I have been with Lord of the Rings while I was reading this book. I was so invested in it from the very beginning that it just worked for me. You can tell from the very start that there is a history to this world. The fact that Philip has been working on this trilogy for many years and all 3 books are coming out this year, meaning that they are all ready to go, means that they're very polished. And not just that they're very polished, it just means that he had a lot of time to work on and confirm the history of the world, and especially the ways that they would interact with the actual story itself, kind of similar to how Tolkien had a very, very deep world even before he wrote Lord of the Rings. Spent a lot of time working on that to the point that he invented languages. Like, not every author is going to want to do that or going to be able to do that, and that's fine. But even though Jormungand isn't as deep per se as Middle Earth is, because again, Middle Earth is just on another level, the point that I'm trying to make is that I was invested in the world of Jormungand in a way that I have not been invested in any world since Middle Earth. So I just thought that worked really well. And then another point that I will say I appreciate about the book, but which we'll talk about in a different section of this review, is that I think that Philip's handling of religion and faith and kind of the depictions of that and how those things are kind of interwoven into the story is really fascinating. Again, we will talk about this in a little bit of a different section, but I would like to point it out as being a general good of the story because it is pretty interesting to read about in different sections. But, of course, this book isn't perfect. Pretty much no book is perfect. Even some of my favorite books are not perfect. The bad of The Way of Edan is relatively short, though. A lot of the things that I'm going to bring up in this section are more or less nitpicky, such as several words that were heavily, heavily overused. Words like curdle and birni. I don't know if I'm pronouncing either of those correctly. Some people had problems with how many times the word rivulet was repeated. There are just a few words that are used, frankly, far too often in the book, and it kind of works to its detriment. By the time you get halfway through the book, you notice every single time the word comes up, and you're just thinking, like, can't you use any other word in this spot instead of the word you've already used 50 times, So that's kind of a nitpicky thing. It got a little bit of annoying with curdle specifically. That was the word that I just really got sick of reading by the time I was getting to the end of the novel. But, complaining about a specific word being overused is kind of a nitpicky thing, like I said. But more than just nitpicks. I suppose there is one, kind of two actual criticisms of this book that I have that I'm willing to forgive because they're not huge things, but they are a little bit irksome in comparison to the quality of the rest of the book. The first of those things being that the inciting incident for the hero's journey starting. I've kind of mentioned this. The incident that causes the main character to have to leave, essentially. It's a little bit contrived and unrealistic, the actual inciting incident itself, because anybody with two brain cells to rub together would have, not done the thing that the main character did to cause that to happen. And anybody reading the book, I'm sure, I would be surprised if there wasn't I would be surprised if the majority of readers didn't feel like this was a little bit because it feels just a tiny bit forced in that sort of contrived way. Because, like I said, anybody with a brain is not going to do that, and any reader reading that scene knows that what the character is doing is stupid. So the fact that it happens is a little bit but pretty much everything else about it is still interesting and fun in a way that I'm not going to put too much weight on this one specific aspect being contrived and unrealistic. I may not love that particular aspect of it, but generally speaking, it is still fine. And then the other thing is that there was a particular set of scenes sort of near the end. I believe it was somewhere in chapter 20-ish. There were, like I said, a couple scenes. How do I explain this without being spoilery? There are a couple scenes where tension plays a major role in how certain interactions with different characters go, and not just, interpersonal tension, I mean like international tension as well. And a couple of these scenes just felt a little bit too easy, like a little bit too smooth in how they were resolved. But considering that the pacing of the rest of the story was all on point, and that changing these two specific scenes could have very well have changed a lot of the rest of the story depending on how it was taken. Again, I'm willing to forgive it, but those two specific scenes did feel a little bit too easy. I suppose the main thing that I can say in favor of them feeling too easy is that they ultimately ended up not mattering in the first place. Not to say that like the scenes didn't have a purpose. They very much did. It's just that the way that the story progressed meant that they actually didn't, even though the characters thought it meant that those scenes actually didn't matter, even though the characters thought they would. So it's just that kind of juxtaposition going on there. And I thought a couple of those scenes, like I said, were a little bit too easy. But outside of those two criticisms, there's really not much to complain about with this book for me, especially. Occasionally, a chapter or a scene would be a tiny bit slow or drawn out. Like, there were maybe a couple POVs that felt like they could have been a couple pages shorter. But beyond, those nitpicky things and then those two legitimate complaints that I said, again, like, I don't really have much to complain about. The problems that I had with the book were rare enough or mattered little enough in terms of the overall culmination of the plot that I just don't really care too much about them, like they don't hamper my overall experience with the book, even if they are worth pointing out. The ugly, this is where we're going to talk about that religion and faith stuff again. There were a handful of brief moments in certain scenes with the book that, in terms of their handling of religion, was a little bit sketchy. It's not necessarily to say that they were done poorly or that the depictions were bad or anything like that. It's just that, like, obviously, I've not made it a secret that I am a Christian or that I am religious in some manner. This book, in its depictions of certain areas of religion, feel very, very, very critical of generalized, organized religion, especially Christianity. It never feels like it's hounding, and pretty much all of the things that it's sort of implicitly criticizing religion for are actually completely fair criticism. So I'm not like upset or anything. I'm not like going to try to defend against certain things that happened in history. Like, I'm not going to do any of that because that's not the point. The point is that there are some ways that Philip Chase handles religion in The Way of Edan that are kind of brutal in just the depiction of religion in general. And that's not, I don't feel like Philip's trying to hound on religiosity in general, especially since the depth of the world and the history and the lore and stuff is so good anyway, and there isn't there are different religious beliefs amongst different peoples in the world anyway, so he's not hounding on religion in general, he's specifically hounding on religious fanaticism. People who are overly committed to a cause in ways that ends up being bad for everyone. This is something that we see with, say, like Catholicism and other Christian denominations in history, where, you know, certain religious groups would do some pretty crazy and horrible stuff in the name of their religion and justify it because God or whatever. And there's a lot of that you will see in this book with one particular group of people, especially, and that's kind of really where the entire plot is going. It seems like it's very much going to be focused on sort of this sort of aspect of the story, again, to not try to get too spoilery, but if you are like a very religious person, you might have some issues with how some of the religion is depicted, but to be honest, it's still done in a very interesting and creative way. And like I said, it doesn't feel like it's needlessly hounding. It's not like everything about the religion is just like religion bad. No, it's like these people, the way that they are doing this religion is bad. And specifically as well, if my theories about where the story over the rest of the trilogy is going, there's a very good chance that Philip is doing the opposite of the whole their religion bad argument. I think he might be doing something a little bit different with it and trying to make the point that certain people in roles of power within religion can be very bad, whereas if you have very good people in those positions of power, it can be very good. That's just my idea of where the trilogy might be going, but that's all I'll say in that matter. It's just, you know, the fact that discussion and the inclusion of certain depictions of religion in a story can be very controversial depending on how they're done. I don't think it's going to be controversial in the story. I just felt like it was worth pointing out as a person who's, you know, somewhat critical of certain things in the Christian history, specifically where Catholicism is involved, where I can totally see where some of those things definitely got an influence from in the real world for this book. But again, that's all I'll say. Anything else I have to say about The Ugly of the Way of Edan is that the final battle scene, the climax, essentially has a couple descriptions that are a little bit more graphic than I was expecting them to be. Not horribly so. And then there was one scene early on, I believe it was in like chapter 6 or 7 or something like that. Let me look. Yeah, looking at the table of contents, I think it was in chapter 6, there was a particular scene there that was actually kind of gross and really sketchy for a little bit of time, but other than, like, you know, just a couple of scenes where things are a little bit gross or a little bit more graphic than maybe I was expecting, there's nothing else to really comment here. It's nothing that, if you are used to reading epic fantasy, especially modern fantasy, it's nothing that you aren't used to. And if you're a fan of grimdark, it doesn't come anywhere near that kind of content. I say as I've not read any grimdark, but based off what I've heard of other people saying, this doesn't come anywhere near it. This is all classic fantasy vibes through and through, which actually kind of leads me into the recommendation of the book. If you love classic fantasy, read this book. This is good for all of those vibes. If you love rich worlds with history and stories and songs and stuff within them that you only kind of get a glimpse at in the story, but you want to know more of because you know there's a lot more behind the scenes that isn't being actually pointed out in the story, this book is good for that. If you love seeing common tropes being flipped on their heads, this is good for that. Genuinely, just, I would say, please read this. And I'm not just saying that again because I'm a friend of Philip's or whatever, because I'm not a friend of Philip's yet. I genuinely want people to read it because it is actually very good. It is a interesting way to write a classic fantasy story without it being stuck in the 80s or, you know, whatever other criticism you could come up with in that regard. I went into this book really tentatively. I wanted to like it, and I wanted to enjoy it so that I could have some good things to say. Like, I didn't want to read it and decide I didn't like it and then, you know, end up doing a review and just being like, it was kind of mixed for me, but there are some things you might like. No, I went in really tentatively and came out absolutely loving it. I don't see very many people rating this below a 3 stars, to be honest, because there's nothing offensively bad about it. Like, even if you prefer stories that are more interesting or more unique or more original, this book still does everything that, you would want it to do just to be a good story. So even if you don't end up loving it as much as I do, I don't see very many people not enjoying it, if that makes sense. So again, I definitely recommend that everybody read it, and since the full trilogy will be out this year, you don't have to wait. It's not going to be an uncertainty of when the next book comes out or when the series will be finished. It is a trilogy. It is pretty much ready to go. Second book comes out here. Whenever this video releases, I want to say the second book probably only comes out in a couple months. Might even be less than a couple months at this point. Might just be like a month and a half when the second book comes out. So like, if you're interested in reading it, I think this release pacing is going to work out for you, because I'm very excited to get to the next book. I am super, super anxious for where the story is going to go next. And I'm just ready to experience more, quite frankly. And I suppose that was something else that I could have probably put into the bad of this book, actually. Now, come to think of it, just now that I'm kind of rambling at the conclusion of the video, is that The Way of Edan is definitely just a part one. It is just an act one to the story of the Edan trilogy. Like, it doesn't really have a happy ending. Even its end point isn't really like a resolved conclusion in any way, and it's not meant to be. But really, that just kind of goes in the book's favor based off the release schedule, knowing that the next book comes in 3 months. It's like releasing the first book, people read it. Oh, the next book comes out in less than 3 months. That's fine. I'm fine with this ending. And I predict that it will be the same thing with the second book. It's actually kind of a genius way to make people excited to get to the next book, since they don't have to wait a full year. Either way, that is the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching. If you stuck through the whole thing, I know I talked a lot about it. I know I kind of rambled for a lot, but I just had, frankly, an absurd amount to say about this book. I'm quite surprised that I had so much to say about it, actually. But I really had a good time with it. I hope more people decide to read it. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you are interested in more reviews, I've already done tons on the channel before. I do pretty much 1 to 3 reviews every single month. I'm sure there was a month randomly where I did upwards of 4 reviews. So I review pretty much all of the books that I read. And if you're interested in watching all of that content or any of the other random stuff that I have coming out on the channel, you can go ahead and subscribe. I have a bunch of other links and stuff down in the description below if you're interested. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave the video off here because I've been talking for way too long. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back in the next video.